As we think about how the Spirit is involved and at work in the world, it's actually quite an exciting thing for us to think about, because in some ways we truly live in the age of the Spirit. We live in a post-Pentecost church where God has poured His Spirit out on His people, where His Spirit now indwells us as the Spirit of God did in the temple in the Old Testament, and empowers us to live both lives that are pleasing to God, but also to live on mission with God in His work in the world. And as we think about the role and the work that the Spirit of God plays in the divine economy, the two terms that come to my mind, at least, are life and truth. One of the major roles that we see the Spirit involved in, both in the Old and New Testament, is in the giving and sustaining of life. Indeed, at the very beginning of creation in Genesis 1 and 2, we see that the Spirit is hovering over these newly formed waters as God begins the creative process. And we're told just a few verses later that as God imparts life to His first creatures, His first human creatures, in particular to Adam, that He breathes His breath into them. Indeed, there is a linguistic resonance with that idea of breathing that should call to our minds the presence and the activity of the Spirit of God. And we find even in the Psalms and other places in the Old Testament that it's the Spirit of God that sustains our very lives. And as we turn over to the New Testament, it's this giving of life that in particular is in focus as the work of the Spirit in the era of the New Covenant, right? This promise that God has made through the Old Testament prophets to pour out His Spirit on His people has happened. That Jesus paid the way, but ultimately it's the Spirit that has been given to the church now to fill them, to lead them, and to guide them. And as a part of that, the Spirit imparts this new life, which is the very life of Jesus Himself. This new resurrection life is imparted to God's people through the Spirit's work. The second dimension I mentioned is truth. And we see maybe two particular examples of this in the New Testament. In several places, the New Testament authors talk about the Spirit as inspiring or directing the words of revelation, be it in the prophets and their spoken words or the written words of Scripture, that the revealing of truth, of God's truth to humans, is a unique role that the Spirit of God plays. And indeed, this is not just a static reality of words on a page, but as we interact with God through His Word, that the Spirit is actually working in our minds and in our hearts to reveal truth to us, to, as Jesus might say, to teach us, to bring to our recollection things that we have learned and known. And so the major way we can think and recall the activity of the Spirit in the plan of God is as the giver of life and the revealer of truth.